I love a good time travel movie. Heck, I love even a bad time travel movie. I'm a sucker for any plot where a character gets to go to the past and meet their younger self or their mother when she was a teenager and make a change that affects the future. It's a satisfying fantasy. Unlike filmmakers, scientists mostly agree that time travel is impossible. The famed physicist Stephen Hawking pointed out that if time travel to the past were possible, wouldn't we constantly be coming across tourists from the future? Though I imagine time tourism to 2020 would be somewhat less popular. To prove his point, he once sent out invitations inviting any time travelers to attend a dinner party which had already happened. Nobody showed up to the party, of course, but Dr. Hawking already knew that. And yet, despite its implausibility, or maybe because of it, the idea of time travel remains incredibly alluring. Scientists publish about 50 papers on the subject every year. I think this fantasy is so enticing because we have been taught that the past is so inaccessible to us. And we might be able to shape the future, but we can never, we feel, go back to the past. And so we fantasize about what we would do. Would we give our younger selves advice? Could we have avoided our mistakes? Fun as these thoughts are, they are just flights of fancy, the purview of speculative fiction. We cannot change the past. Except this week's Torah portion argues that in some meaningful way, we can. The Parsha is Vayechi, the last portion in the book of Genesis. After a long and winding journey, Joseph has reunited with his brothers, the same brothers who kicked off that journey by selling him into slavery. Joseph has risen from the lows of enslavement and prison to the second highest position in Egypt, where he now has the power to save not only his own family, but an entire nation. Still, his brothers are on edge around him. Though they have proven more than once that they have changed, that they are no longer the men who contemplated fratricide all those years ago, they worry that Joseph still holds a grudge. They look at this powerful prince of Egypt and think, who could blame him if he had it in for us? When their father Jacob dies, they feel certain that this was the last tether holding back Joseph's anger. So they come to him once again, begging forgiveness and pardon. Joseph's response is powerful. He says, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Though his brothers caused him great tragedy and hardship, Joseph has come to understand that a powerful good has come from that pain. But any of us who has experienced trauma knows that it is hard to learn to see this. Even when some good comes from our pain, we cannot muster the magnanimity that Joseph shows his brothers. So how did he do it? To answer that question, we will have to travel a little bit forward in time to the period of the Talmud. One of the most interesting characters of the Talmud is a 3rd century sage named Reish Lakish. He starts his story as a highway robber and a gladiator. In his journeys, he encounters the great teacher, Rabbi Yochanan, who convinces Reish Lakish to give up his marauding ways and join the house of study. He becomes Yochanan's disciple and eventually a great thinker on his own right. Though he has forsworn his violent ways, he is occasionally called on to use his skills from his days as a youthful ruffian. Once he rescued a colleague, Rabbi Imi, who had been kidnapped. Another time, his teacher, Rabbi Yochanan, was robbed, and Lakish went to retrieve what was stolen. Still, he is known as one of the most famous Ba'alei Teshuvah, penitents, of the Talmudic era. The Talmud in Tractate Yoma records 2 somewhat strange sayings of Reish Lakish on the topic of repentance, of Teshuvah. He said, "Great is repentance because through it a deliberate sin is accounted as unintentional." And he goes on to say, "Great is repentance because through it deliberate sins are accounted as though they were merits." The first of these 2 sentences we can almost make sense of. Repentance is powerful because through it, we turn our intentional misdeeds into unintentional ones. An apology, even a good one, doesn't change what happened. And yet, in some way, it reshapes the past, or at least how we feel about it. I teach a class every year in preparation for the High Holy Days called The Art of the Celebrity Apology, where we use the Jewish laws of teshuvah to analyze public requests for forgiveness. And we look at some really good ones and some really bad ones. A bad apology says something like, I did not mean to hurt you. You may not have meant it, but that doesn't change the impact. You hurt me. Or a bad apology might say something like, if you knew me, you'd see that I am not that kind of person. That may not be who you think of yourself as, but you still did the thing, so in some way you were that person. But a good apology might say something like, that's not who I strive to be. That's different, if subtly so. You take ownership for the choice you made in that moment. Whether or not you knew at the time what the impact would be, you see now what impact it had. You understand and demonstrate that understanding now. You show you are growing and learning and striving to be better moving forward. And in that way, the person you have harmed might come to understand that even though at the time your actions were intentional, in retrospect, they feel unintentional. Through a good apology, you don't change the past, but rather maybe our feelings about the past as we look back. So we can make sense of that first half of Reish Lakish's teaching, but the second half is even more radical. Great is teshuvah because it turns intentional wrongdoings into merits. That might seem hard to fathom, but Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks teaches that maybe Reish Lakish is drawing this principle from the story in our parsha. Joseph says, you intended those actions for harm, but God intended them for good. As Sacks writes, any act we perform has multiple consequences, some good, some bad. When we intend evil, the bad consequences are attributed to us because they were what we sought to achieve. The good consequences are not. They are mere byproducts, happenstance, unintended outcomes. We know this in our own day. Imagine your car is stolen. Even if the insurance company replaces the car and what we buy is nicer than what we had, even if we never liked that other car anyway, we are still likely resentful of the thief for the time and the trouble that they caused. There were positive impacts of their actions, a new car, but because they did not intend those consequences, we are not inclined to credit them to the thief. This is also why we can hold resentment for politicians who do ostensibly good things, but for self-serving or corrupt reasons. We might appreciate the consequences of their actions, but they were only unintended. But when actual teshuvah occurs, those intentions can be transformed. We might be able to ascribe the positive consequences to the person apologizing. I say might because it is important to note that while Judaism requires us to apologize for our mistakes, it never requires us to forgive. Forgiveness is hard and sometimes impossible. We are encouraged to try, but forgiveness is a gift that we give ourselves and the other person, and a gift can never be coerced. Forgiveness also does not mean forgetfulness. We may choose to forgive, and yet we will remember what that person did. We may never be able to fully trust them again. We may no longer wish to be in relationship with them. We are encouraged to forgive, but we are never required to put ourselves in risky situations, even when the other person is repentant. Still, this kind of transformative teshuvah that Joseph experiences from his brothers is maybe the kind that Reish Lakish is talking about. Because they are truly sorry, they have done the work to examine their past actions and shown with their subsequent choices that they will not make the same errors again. Joseph is able to grant that sacred and surprising gift of forgiveness. And when he does, he can see that God had intended it all for good. This speaks to a challenge we face when we experience hurt. There can be a pressure to look for silver linings. We might hear something like, God works in mysterious ways. Maybe there are blessings here. But when we are experiencing trauma, these words ring hollow. Couldn't God have made something good for me by doing good instead of hurting me? But this is the power of a good apology. The good that was the side effect of painful actions, that good belongs to God, not to the perpetrator. That's what Joseph means by God intended it for good. But when the perpetrator is truly penitent, and if we are able to forgive, then we might gain a new access to that good, an increased ability to see and appreciate the unintended fruit that were born from that unfortunate seed. And in that way, the past has been transformed, not because the events have changed, but because we now understand them in a different way. The science fiction author Ursula K. Le Guin writes, "Story is our only boat for sailing on the river of time." In a way, I'm sure she meant fiction and its power to help us explore our past and our future. But this quote is also more broadly about the stories we tell ourselves. There are two pasts. Of course, there is the past of history, of facts and events, but there is another past, the past of memory, the stories we tell ourselves about those events and what they mean. Without an impossible time machine, we cannot visit the past of history. But it is within our power to revisit and even reshape the past of memory, to change through acts of teshuvah and forgiveness the stories we tell ourselves about that past. This is the truth that Reish Lakish knew from his own life. His days of robbery and thuggery were transformed by his teshuvah, not because they were erased or forgotten, but because they were recast. He was able to use the skills he had learned in those times to do good in later times. He traded in his sharp sword for an incisive intellect that allowed him to see things in the Torah that his colleagues who spent their lives in the academy could not. And when the need arose, he even used his strength and cunning to stand up for the weak and the vulnerable, so that looking back, he could see that those bad things he had done in his youth might have resulted in some benefit. And because he was truly repentant, he merited that credit. This Shabbat falls on the first day of the new year. There is so much desire to put 2020 behind us, to lock it in that impenetrable vault known as the past of history. But this is not the Jewish way. We are the people who follow our new year with 10 days of examination and repentance. Our calendar reminds us of that truth from Faulkner: the past is never dead, it's not even past. Maybe 2021 would benefit from a few days of repentance, of looking back, of considering where we have misstepped as individuals and as a nation. What teshuvah does 2020 still require? We have made incredible sacrifices this past year and lost more than we can yet express. But we have also made mistakes and missteps. And until we have examined them, we will not know how to avoid them in the future. We may be on the road to recovery, but until we have analyzed the steps that got us to this place, especially the steps that were hasty, selfish, or untruthful, we will never be able to reap any of the unintentional benefits from them. We must build for tomorrow, but we must also look to yesterday for guidance. Perhaps this is why I love time travel plots. Because as a Jew, the question of what I might change in my past is not hypothetical or fantastical, it is practical. To shape my future, I must keep examining the story of my past. To move forward into the future, we must go back to the past in honest examination and heartfelt teshuvah. May 2021 be a better year for our congregation, our community, our country, and this world, and may we all be willing to do the work to make it so. Shabbat Shalom.